The year was 53 BCE. The Roman Republic, at its zenith, controlled vast stretches of land across Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Near East. Its legions, led by some of the greatest generals in history, were often considered an unstoppable force. Rome's military might was unrivaled, its reputation one of invincibility. But in the midst of this unparalleled power, there existed a shadowed chapter in its history, a battle so devastating that the empire itself would go to great lengths to ensure it was forgotten. This was a conflict so catastrophic that Rome would attempt to erase its very memory. The battle was the Battle of Carrhae, and it would forever alter the course of Roman military history. The man at the heart of this tragedy was Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome and a member of the infamous First Triumvirate, alongside Pompey and Julius Caesar. Crassus was not only a political figure but also a man obsessed with cementing his legacy. While Pompey and Caesar sought glory through conquest in the West, Crassus fixated on the eastern frontier. His ambition was not only to match his rivals but to surpass them. He dreamed of glory in the East, a place where Rome's influence had been minimal compared to the vast and ancient empires that had once dominated the region. The Parthian Empire, to the east, was a rising power, one that stood as a formidable challenge to Rome's expanding borders. Crassus was no fool. He knew the power of the Parthian Empire. The Parthians were expert cavalrymen, famed for their heavy cavalry, especially the cataphracts, heavily armored horsemen who were a nightmare for traditional infantry-based armies. But Crassus was driven by something deeper than just ambition. He sought to match, if not exceed, the military accomplishments of his triumvirate partners. Pompey had conquered Spain, and Caesar had conquered Gaul. Now it was Crassus's turn to stake his claim in the annals of history. His plan was to invade Parthian Mesopotamia and secure a victory that would secure his place as one of Rome's greatest generals. The Roman Senate was initially hesitant about Crassus's campaign. They had little interest in a costly war in the East, but Crassus, using his vast wealth and political influence, managed to secure their approval. The Senate reluctantly endorsed his plans, and in the spring of 53 BCE, Crassus led his army of around 35,000 men into the vast deserts of Mesopotamia, confident that his superior Roman discipline and tactics would easily overcome the Parthian threat. What Crassus failed to anticipate was the skill and cunning of the Parthian general, Surena. Surena was a brilliant military strategist, famed for his use of cavalry. His forces, though smaller in number, were equipped with some of the best cavalry units in the ancient world, including the heavily armored cataphracts, and he knew how to use them to devastating effect. Surena's tactics would exploit the very weaknesses that Crassus failed to see in his own army. As Crassus marched deeper into Parthian territory, he faced increasingly hostile terrain and unfamiliar challenges. The desert landscape, far from being the place for a quick victory, became a trap that slowly drained the Roman forces of supplies and morale. The Roman legions, accustomed to the more temperate climates of Europe, began to suffer from the harsh conditions. They were not prepared for the relentless heat, the dust storms, and the lack of water. But it was not only the desert that threatened Crassus's forces, it was the Parthian strategy that would soon become clear. Surena, rather than meeting Crassus head-on in an open battle, used his superior cavalry to harass and disrupt the Roman supply lines. He deployed his cataphracts with deadly precision, cutting down isolated Roman units and targeting supply wagons. The Parthian general knew that if he could stretch Crassus's army thin and wear them down, the Romans would eventually be forced to face him on his terms. Crassus, however, remained convinced that the Parthians were weak and would soon crumble under the might of Rome. But as the days passed, his optimism began to wane. His army, now cut off from reinforcements and supplies, was slowly being strangled by the relentless Parthian tactics. He had no choice but to press on, despite the growing realization that this campaign was not going according to plan. As the Roman army reached the town of Carrhae, they were at their most vulnerable. The desert had already taken its toll on the men, and the Parthian forces were closing in. Crassus decided to make his stand. He knew that retreat would be disastrous for the morale of his troops, so he prepared to fight. The Parthians, sensing an opportunity, positioned their forces around Carrhae, using the terrain to their advantage. Surina had chosen the battlefield with meticulous care, and he knew exactly how he would strike. The battle began with a fierce Roman charge, as Crassus's legions advanced in their typical formation, hoping to break the Parthian lines. But Surina's cavalry swiftly surrounded the Romans, and the battle soon descended into chaos. The Roman infantry, trapped and outnumbered, was no match for the Parthian cavalry. The cataphracts, with their heavy armor and powerful lances, broke through the Roman ranks, devastating their lines. The Parthian horse archers, skilled in harassing tactics, unleashed a deadly rain of arrows, further breaking the Roman formation. Crassus's forces fought valiantly, but they were overwhelmed. The Roman legions, so accustomed to defeating enemies through disciplined formations, were unable to adapt to the speed and ferocity of the Parthian cavalry. The Romans were not used to fighting in such close quarters, where the cavalry could strike and retreat with such deadly efficiency. The battle turned into a slaughter, with thousands of Roman soldiers falling to the Parthian charge. As the day wore on, the situation became increasingly desperate for the Romans. Crassus, realizing the battle was lost, attempted to rally his forces, but the morale had already broken. His commanders were either dead or scattered, and his men were retreating in disarray. In a final desperate move, Crassus attempted to negotiate with Surina, hoping for some sort of mercy. But the Parthian general, ever the tactician, knew that to allow Crassus to escape would only give the Romans a chance to regroup and retaliate. Instead, he ordered Crassus's death, ensuring that the man who had once been one of Rome's most powerful figures would never return to Rome. The aftermath of Carrhae was a disaster for Rome. Not only had they suffered a crushing military defeat, but they had lost one of their most influential generals. The Parthians, emboldened by their victory, continued to harass Rome's eastern provinces. But for the Romans, the defeat had deeper repercussions. Carrhae shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. It was a blow to Roman pride, and it sent ripples throughout the empire. In the wake of the battle, Rome did everything in its power to erase the memory of Carrhae. It was too humiliating, too catastrophic for the Roman public to bear. Crassus's failure was swept under the rug, and the empire's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to prevent the defeat from becoming a symbol of weakness. The official Roman record hardly mentioned the battle, and any historians who dared to write about it found themselves facing political pressure to downplay its significance. The battle that should have marked a turning point in Roman history was, for the most part, forgotten. It became a black mark in the annals of Rome's military past, hidden away like a shameful secret. But despite Rome's efforts to suppress it, the Battle of Carrhae remains a testament to the dangers of overconfidence, the cost of unchecked ambition, and the fragile nature of empire. For the Parthians, it was a victory that demonstrated the might of their cavalry and their military genius. For Rome, it was a lesson that even the most powerful empire in the world could fall victim to its own hubris. The legacy of Carrhae, though largely ignored, should not be forgotten. It serves as a reminder that no empire, no matter how great, is invincible. The Parthian Empire at the time of Crassus's ill-fated campaign was one of the most powerful forces in the ancient world. Stretching from the Persian Gulf in the south to the Caucasus Mountains in the north, and from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the west to the eastern Iranian plateau, the Parthians controlled a vast swath of territory that rivaled Rome's in both size and power. Yet, unlike the highly centralized Roman state, the Parthian Empire was a complex federation of loosely bound regions, each ruled by local nobles and tribal leaders, but unified under the powerful figure of the King of Kings, or Shahanshah. At the time of Crassus's campaign, the Parthian king was Oroda II, a ruler who would prove to be a cunning and ruthless adversary. But it wasn't Oroda II who would be the true architect of Parthian success at Carrhae. That role belonged to a man named Surina. A Parthian noble and military commander, Surina was one of the brightest minds of his generation. He had already proven his abilities on smaller battlefields, but it was his handling of the Roman threat in 53 BCE that would cement his legacy as one of the greatest tacticians of the ancient world. Surina's approach to warfare was unorthodox by Roman standards, and it was precisely this difference in tactics that would lead to Rome's disastrous defeat. Surina understood the Roman way of war. He had observed it for years, seen the Roman legions march across the battlefield in their disciplined formations, their shields locked, their weapons raised in unison. The Roman legion was a formidable force, but it was also a predictable one. Crassus, in particular, was known for his overconfidence, often relying on the might of Rome's legions rather than the subtlety of strategy. Surina's genius lay in his ability to exploit these very weaknesses. The Parthian army, under Surina's command, was a force based on the mastery of cavalry. The Parthians were renowned for their heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, heavily armored horsemen armed with long spears and lances. These warriors were a fearsome sight on the battlefield, charging at full speed with the power to shatter infantry formations. But it wasn't just the cataphracts that made Surina's army so dangerous. The Parthian cavalry also included lighter horse archers, whose ability to shoot arrows while riding at high speed made them one of the most effective skirmish forces in the ancient world. This combination of heavy cavalry and agile horse archers created a flexible, dynamic force capable of both direct assault and rapid, harassing maneuvers. In the months leading up to the battle, Surina was well aware of Crassus's advance. He knew that the Roman general would come with his powerful legions, expecting to fight in the traditional Roman style. Surina, however, was determined to avoid a head-on confrontation. Instead, he focused on undermining Crassus's army before they ever reached the battlefield. He used his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage, leading the Romans into the desert, a harsh environment that would drain their resources and morale. The desert's extreme heat, its lack of water, and its vast expanses were all tools in Surina's strategy to weaken the Romans psychologically before they even saw a single Parthian soldier. Surina's tactics were not just about the physical environment, they were also about sowing discord within the Roman ranks. Crassus, eager for a quick and decisive victory, became impatient as his army struggled through the barren land. His men, exhausted by the harsh conditions, began to suffer from dehydration and fatigue. The Roman generals, meanwhile, were divided. Some were eager for battle, believing that once they confronted the Parthians, they would easily crush them. Others began to question the wisdom of their mission. Crassus, however, remained resolute. His arrogance led him to believe that the Parthians were mere barbarians, no match for the disciplined Roman legions. By the time Crassus reached the town of Carrhae, his army was already in disarray. Supplies had dwindled, and morale had plummeted. Crassus, still unwilling to acknowledge the severity of the situation, decided that a decisive battle was the only way forward. It was here that Surina would spring his trap. Rather than meeting Crassus's legions head-on, Surina carefully arranged his forces around the Roman army, using the terrain and his cavalry to create a situation in which the Romans were forced into a battle they could not win. Surina's Parthian army was smaller than Crassus's, but it was far more mobile and better suited to the terrain. The Parthians positioned their forces in a way that allowed them to strike swiftly and retreat just as quickly, avoiding the kind of bloody engagement that the Romans expected. The cataphracts, positioned on the flanks, would charge at the Roman lines, breaking them apart with their sheer weight and force. Meanwhile, the horse archers would harass the Romans from a distance, keeping them pinned down and unable to form a cohesive defense. The Parthians were not interested in a battle of attrition, they were focused on speed and precision, picking apart the Roman legions piece by piece. When the battle finally began, Crassus was taken by surprise. The Romans, expecting the Parthians to follow the conventional patterns of ancient warfare, were ill-prepared for Surina's unconventional tactics. The cataphracts, with their heavy armor and powerful lances, tore into the Roman lines, pushing back the legions. The horse archers, in turn, kept the Roman infantry on the defensive, firing arrows at them from all directions, never allowing them to regroup or retaliate. The Roman soldiers, trained to fight in tight formations, struggled to adapt to the fluid and fast-paced nature of the battle. They were simply not equipped to deal with the Parthian cavalry's mobility and the relentless pressure from the horse archers. As the battle raged on, Crassus's forces began to break apart. The Roman legions, once a symbol of discipline and strength, were now in disarray, scattered across the battlefield as the Parthians picked them off one by one. The Roman commanders, unable to coordinate their efforts, were either killed or forced to flee. The disaster was unfolding before Crassus's eyes, but there was little he could do to reverse the tide. His once proud army was being decimated by the superior tactics of Surina, and the Roman general had no plan to counter it. The final blow came when Crassus, realizing that the battle was lost, attempted to negotiate with Surina, hoping to save what was left of his army. But Surina, ever the tactician, knew that to allow Crassus to escape would be to risk another Roman invasion in the future. He ordered Crassus's death, ensuring that the man who had once been one of Rome's most powerful generals would not return to Rome to lead another campaign. The Parthian victory at Carrhae was a stunning achievement, one that demonstrated the effectiveness of Surina's strategy and the brilliance of his command. It was a victory that would send shockwaves through the Roman Empire, one that would challenge the very myth of Roman invincibility. The Parthians, once thought to be a barbaric and primitive force, had shown the world that they were a military power to be reckoned with. But for Surina, the victory would be bittersweet. Despite his brilliance on the battlefield, he would not live to enjoy the fruits of his success. The political intrigues of the Parthian court would soon lead to his downfall, as his rivals, jealous of his fame and success, conspired against him. In the end, Surina's legacy, much like the victory at Carrhae, would be erased by the shifting tides of history. But for a brief moment, the Parthians had stood toe-to-toe with Rome and had emerged victorious, forever altering the balance of power in the ancient world. As Crassus and his army advanced into Parthian territory, the difficulties of the march began to set in. Crassus had underestimated the complexities of leading a Roman legion across such harsh terrain. He had been accustomed to battles in Europe, where supply lines were easier to manage, the weather more temperate, and the logistics of maintaining an army less taxing. But the journey into Mesopotamia presented challenges that no Roman military experience had prepared him for. The army faced relentless heat, unrelenting dust storms, and an almost complete lack of water sources. The Parthian desert was a brutal environment, one that drained the Roman forces of their strength and patience. The soldiers, used to the more temperate conditions of Europe and North Africa, struggled with the extreme conditions. The camels that carried supplies were often too slow or unable to cross the harsh landscape, and soon the army found itself running dangerously low on food and water. Even the seasoned Roman legionaries, famed for their endurance, began to show signs of exhaustion. The soldiers were tired, dehydrated, and increasingly demoralized, but Crassus was determined to press forward. His sense of Roman superiority and the belief that his mission was inevitable made retreat unthinkable. He was blind to the warnings of his officers and ignored the advice of experienced soldiers. Crassus's leadership began to show signs of strain. While he had been a successful politician and a wealthy man, he was not a seasoned field general like Pompey or Caesar. His military experience had been limited to suppressing internal Roman revolts and securing wealth in the east, but now he found himself facing an enemy unlike any he had encountered before. The Parthians were masters of the terrain, and they had a deep understanding of how to fight in the desert, something Crassus failed to grasp. As Crassus's army pushed deeper into Parthian lands, the Roman general became more desperate. His initial plan had been simple: march towards the Parthian heartland, face the enemy, and defeat them. But as the army became more fatigued and disorganized, the prospect of a direct confrontation with Surina's forces began to look less appealing. The Parthian army, though smaller, was far more mobile. Surina, a master of strategy, had already begun to harass the Romans from the shadows. His forces, including the famed Parthian horse archers, skirmished with the Roman supply lines, targeting vulnerable Roman convoys carrying food and water. Surina's cavalry, with their light, fast-moving horses, were able to strike quickly and retreat before the Romans could respond. The Roman soldiers were caught in a war of attrition, being worn down not by the main Parthian army but by a relentless series of small, disruptive attacks. It wasn't just the Parthian cavalry that posed a threat. The Parthians were masters of psychological warfare, and Surina knew how to use the desert's isolation and the fear of the unknown to his advantage. While Crassus's men had been accustomed to fighting enemies on familiar terrain, the desert threw their senses off balance. The heat, the endless dunes, and the haunting silence of the vast emptiness played tricks on their minds. Many of the soldiers began to question their purpose, and as supplies dwindled, even Crassus began to doubt his decision-making. He had not accounted for the toll the desert would take on his men, and now he had no choice but to press forward, knowing that turning back was a sign of weakness. The situation became even more dire when Crassus received reports that Surina's army was moving towards his location. While the Roman general had expected to be the one to initiate the battle, the Parthians were taking their time, and Crassus's impatience grew. His army, already at the breaking point, now faced the additional threat of a Parthian advance. Crassus was left with little choice. He had to make a stand, but he knew the risk of doing so in the current state of his army. His men were exhausted, their morale shattered, and their discipline slipping. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Crassus refused to alter his plans. He ordered the army to make its way to Carrhae, a small town that would become the site of the battle that would change everything.